Bear shaft tuning is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in archery. Most shooters have been conditioned to believe that aerodynamic instability is perfectly acceptable and have little to no understanding of how the arrows react out of the bow or understand what the arrow is doing in flight. So in this video, I want to explain my process for bear shaft tuning, why I do it this way, and what I'm actually looking for from the arrow. Because to me, tuning is not some voodoo gimmick. It's about understanding physics and external ballistics in order to control dynamic behavior. First, let's talk about what's actually happening when an arrow leaves the bow. When the release breaks, the string drives the knock end of the arrow forward extremely aggressively. But because the point end is heavier than the knock end, the point end resists movement. This is called inertia. That means the back of the arrow accelerates faster than the front end of the arrow for a split second. And that difference in acceleration causes the shaft to flex. That flex is completely normal. In fact, a perfectly tuned arrow should flex. The goal is not to eliminate the flex. The goal is controlled flex and rapid recovery. A properly spined arrow bends, stores energy, and then dampens that oscillation quickly and settles into aerodynamically stable flight. An improper spine doesn't recover, and that's exactly where planing starts. So to start, I refer to a specific arrow spine chart and start with the spine that I think is most likely to get the result I'm looking for. Then I always start with an arrow that is likely much longer than where I'll end up. I always do this because a longer arrow is dynamically weaker, and that gives me somewhere to go. Because if I was to start with an arrow that's too stiff, I'm stuck, and you cannot add arrow length back once it's cut. And if I start somewhere closer to optimum, it will be more difficult to know if my arrow is reacting too weak or too stiff, and oftentimes the results aren't obvious. So I intentionally begin with a shaft that's slightly weak. That way, any planing is almost certainly due to the arrow being too weak, and I don't have to guess how to fix the issue. From there, I cut a ½ inch off the arrow and retest, repeating this process until I found the perfect spine for my bow's configuration. And this is important. Weak and stiff arrows fail differently. A weak arrow flexes excessively. The shaft bends too much, takes too long to recover, and continues oscillating downrange. You'll see big exaggerated movement in the shaft. That continued flex creates aerodynamic instability. And eventually, the arrow starts planing. A stiff arrow, on the other hand, is interesting because people often think stiff means quick recovery and better stability, but that's not actually true. A stiff arrow often behaves almost like a tuning fork. Instead of properly loading and unloading energy through controlled flex, it corrects and continues vibrating all the way down range. The shaft never really settles. It keeps oscillating because it's too stiff to absorb and dampen the energy correctly. So both weak and stiff arrows can fail to recover. They just do it in a different way. Weak arrows usually show large oscillations, whereas stiff arrows tend to show smaller but much faster persistent vibrations. But both will plane in flight. So to bear shaft tune, first get a clean or nearly clean paper tear with your bear shaft at just a few feet. A clean paper tear indicates that the spine is in the ballpark and the rest is in an acceptable starting position. But a clean paper tear is just that, a starting position. To properly bear shaft tune, you've got to keep going. I care way more about downrange behavior than paper tears. I want clean flight, minimal oscillation, and no visible planing. So shoot a fletched arrow at 50 yards, then a bear shaft, and take note of how the bear shaft impacts the target in relation to the fletched shaft. And I can't stress this point enough. If the arrow goes into the target sideways, it is always, always, always a spine issue. And if the spine is correct and the arrow rests just slightly out of position, the arrow will still fly straight. If it planes, the arrow is not recovering properly. Because we started with a shaft that is too long and almost certainly too weak, we know the fix is to stiffen the arrow, and we accomplish this by cutting it back a ½ inch at a time. We could also accomplish it by using less point weight or less draw weight, but I always set my bows up for feel and try to avoid making changes to the bow to make the arrow tune. Instead, I always elect to build an arrow that works out of my preferred configuration. I think changing the bow for a specific arrow is the wrong approach, and you end up sacrificing the feel you want. So again, I recommend just cutting the arrow back a ½ inch at a time. Every cut dynamically stiffens the spine. So what I'm doing is creeping up on the perfect recovery point. At first, the shaft may be too weak. You'll see that exaggerated flex and slow recovery. But then as the arrow shortens, the recovery starts getting faster and cleaner. The oscillation dampens sooner, and What you're left with is an arrow that enters stable flight earlier. And eventually, you hit the sweet spot. That's what I'm looking for. That point where the arrow flexes properly, but recovers almost immediately out of the bow. And one thing I want people to understand is this: perfect tune does not mean the arrow flies perfectly rigid. Every arrow is going to flex out of the bow. The difference is how fast the shaft actually recovers. That's what separates stable flight from unstable flight. And this is why Bareshaft tuning is so powerful, in my opinion, because the fletchings hide the problems, whereas a Bareshaft exposes them. It lets you see the dynamic behavior of the arrow. It shows you whether the shaft is recovering correctly or whether the arrow is still fighting itself downrange. And understanding that, bare shaft tuning starts making a lot more sense, because tuning is really just about energy management. You're trying to get the arrow to absorb, transfer, and dampen energy efficiently enough to enter stable aerodynamic flight as quickly as possible. That's the whole game. Once the bare shaft flies perfectly straight at distance, then the shooter can group tune their rest to find the position where the bare shafts group the best. And most high level shooters do some form of group tuning, but almost none of them are doing it with bare shafts. Remember, the fletchings hide errors, bare shafts expose them. So if you want the absolute best grouping bow you've ever had, group tuning must be done with bare shafts. Group sizes in relation to rest position becomes extremely obvious, whereas group tuning with fletchings often produce similar results regardless of rest position, especially for those that aren't at a super elite level. But don't take my word for it. Try this process for yourself, and I guarantee you that you'll shoot the best groups you ever have.